Dragon Age Inquisition is one of the many RPGs that would come to mind when people would ask me, what RPG should I play? Funny enough, I couldn't remember much about the finer details of Dragon Age Inquisition. I just remember that I had a great time while playing it. I'm only 22, and I think I played this game when I was 15? And when people would recently ask me about the game, I'd resort back to my dumb 15-year-old thought process. Your choices matter, the companions are good, it's open world sorta. Oh, and of course, you can have sex in it.
The game of the year, Dragon Age Inquisition.
It being game of the year in 2014 not only reassured my 15-year-old thought process, but it's what gave me the idea of playing through this game again in 2024. Does Dragon Age Inquisition hold up 10 years later? The ability to choose your race, class, and make important decisions through dialogue, Dragon Age Inquisition is at its core an RPG. But how deep do those RPG mechanics go? And at the end of the day, it's a BioWare game. So how interesting are the companions?
We played by the fire so she would be warm. No, it's summer, Liddy.
This thing you do. Maybe you should stop doing it?
Companions in Dragon Age Inquisition not only give the world a voice, but they are also my favorite thing about this game going back to it. There's so much flavor sprinkled throughout the 9 companions. Granted, some got a lot more flavor than others. They interact with each other and your character differently depending on dialogue and character decisions such as your race, but they mostly fit under the character archetypes that you'd come to expect out of an RPG. There's a pretentious but charismatic guy. There's a character that wants to run away from their past. And this companion,
Solus,
this guy is racist.
we cannot change our nature.
Yikes. But of course, those are only 3 of the 9 companions, and you're bound to find some of them interesting. And it's not just the ambient dialogue and interesting dialogue trees that make these companions interesting. It's also their unique quest lines. Each character's quest line is fruitful and compelling. They're short subplots that focus on the growth of whichever character's quest line you are doing, and you as a player are given the choice to either help or prevent them from growing. It is pretty binary, but being able to have a definitive impact on each character's story is pretty gratifying. What isn't fulfilling is the amount of bloat that you have to get through in order to access these fruitful quest lines. There's a feature in Dragon Age Inquisition that not only plagues your progression with companion and side quests, but also plagues every single form of progression in the entire game.
You about to make me do a war table mission to freaking open up your place to get a freaking a dumb little item for a fetch quest, and to complete said fetch quest I need to level my influence, which requires me to grind a bunch to just freaking do it.
The best parts of Dragon Age Inquisition are sadly accompanied by easily the worst feature of this game. Instead of progressing through characters' stories naturally, you're sometimes or oftentimes time gated out of content for God knows what reason. It makes sense for characters' stories to be staggered depending on where you are in the main story of a game, but the staggering feels a bit artificial, especially when a story starts to get interesting and you're prompted to go to a mission board. At the mission board, you're prompted to send people out on a mission for the next 15 minutes to an hour to unlock the next story thread. The time could vary drastically, it could be less than 15 minutes, it could be more than an hour, but you get the idea. The system feels incredibly awkward, and I'd rather just do fetch quests to buffer or stagger the story delivery. Sadly, the mission board doesn't void Inquisition of fetch quests, or a power grind that is sometimes required to unlock zones for characters' stories. These barriers to entry are unnecessarily bothersome, but luckily there are mods, and I'd very highly recommend you download these to remove the unnecessary gating. This offense thankfully doesn't bleed as much through the main questline. I mean, there's still a power grind, which is very common through RPG games. You have to get to a certain level to progress the next story beat. I digress. The main story of Dragon Age Inquisition is... it's alright. Luckily, it's able to fall back onto its rich world, and that's thanks to the amount of content that relies on central themes that carry over throughout the entirety of the game. It also, like, straight up feels kind of weird to dig into a game that's almost 10 years old now for the flaws in its narrative. So I'm not going to. There are a ton of flaws, but the lore and the history, the world is cool. Oh, and there's like a handful of decisions to make an impact, and those are pretty fun. The story would not be a reason I'd recommend another person to play through this game for. Now the side stories, those are good, but like, you know, very bloated. It's complicated. Anyways, let's talk about the combat. The combat is strange. It's gratifying and fun when you're able to build your character into a specific playstyle, but outside of that, it's kind of clunky and awkward, or I should say it hasn't aged incredibly well. That's not to say that it's bad, as I just said that crafting a specific build is gratifying. Being able to pick a class and further dial down into a subclass that enhances the way that you like to approach combat is good. In a weird way, it almost reminded me of playing a traditional ARPG. I don't think Diablo's combat is very fun, isolated from your skill trees and or other forms of power. And Dragon Age Inquisition's combat is very much the same way. Mechanically, it's reminiscent of a tab targeting MMO, but less responsive. And this lack of responsiveness or awkwardness made me remember why I didn't recommend people play this game for the combat. A majority of the time, you'll be holding an attack button whilst pressing abilities when they're available. And occasionally, you'll take control of one of your 3 other characters to resurrect your character, or maybe to try and spice up combat a bit, experience the game through a different class's lens. You're also able to pause the combat through a tactician view and preload or do actions for characters, almost as if it was a CRPG. It's a bit weird, but that also gives more control when the combat isn't responding incredibly well. If you like RPGs and theory crafting, I could see you having fun with the combat. I mean, I had fun for like the first 25 hours with the combat, probably because that's how long it took me to tinker together my build until I turned it into something that felt very powerful, and problem solving in the skill tree and with abilities was fun, even if these systems are relatively shallow compared to other games. Now, was going back and exploring these zones interesting? I guess that's also a complicated question. Instead of a cohesive open world, Dragon Age Inquisition has opted for many different zones that all act as mini open worlds. And these zones have a lot, and I mean a lot, of fetch quests and mindless content. And outside of needing to level up for the next quest or needing resources for a new upgrade, there isn't a whole lot to do in these zones if we don't include the more interesting quest lines that utilize a small portion of the area. I remember being driven to explore these zones when I first played the game, but I don't remember if that's because I thought it visually looked super cool, the amount of free time I had, or the promise of loot. And in terms of loot, I don't think the itemization in this game is incredible. It's very bare bones, and I didn't feel like acquiring new pieces of equipment really changed the experience too much, outside of needing to do more damage. I mean, there are different abilities and stuff attached to gear, but nothing extraordinary. I guess if you're super into the combat and or player progression, it might be fun to explore these zones for the sake of accomplishing those goals. But outside of seeing the odd dragon in the zones that invigorated me with the sense of urgency, the scale of the zones feel a bit frivolous. Maybe a lot of the content, if you're going to play this game, you can avoid a lot of it, outside of the companion quests that seem interesting to you and or side quests of characters that you are fascinated by. Going back to the game almost 10 years after its release makes me wish a lot of the content was trimmed off. Like, I do think that the companions, the side quests, and some of the RPG systems, albeit relatively shallow, make this game worth playing in 2024. But with all of the other stuff around it, it makes it hard for me to recommend this game to anyone in 2024. If you're gonna try it because it seems to be on sale constantly, or because you need to fill that RPG itch, I'd really recommend that you download a mod that gets rid of most of the filler content. And even then, if you somehow haven't played the original Mass Effect trilogy, I'd recommend that you go through that instead, as the same execution bar of narrative delivery and for its companions, but in a far more streamlined experience that makes it age far better, and depending on who you ask, more interesting writing. It's hard because I used to really love this game, and I still do like it, but fast food tastes a lot better when somebody isn't belittling you for enjoying it. Some choices matter, the companions are good, and the open-ish world needs some trimming.